Hello and welcome to this tutorial on how to make peyote stitch beaded rings. Ooh, how many rings does one person need? Turns out lots and lots. In this video I will be showing you which materials you need, how to get started, how to follow a pattern, how to finish, and then a variation at the end should you want to create a slightly different ring. So let's get started. Okay. So let's have a closer look at what we're going to be making in this tutorial. You'll see I've got 3 different rings here and I've provided the pattern for each one of those. But if you look closely, you'll notice that each one is slightly different. So these 2 are made up of an even amount of rows. So you'll see on this one we've got 8 rows, this one we've got 6, and this one has 7. Now, the bulk of this tutorial is going to be focusing on making what we call even count rings, as that's the simplest way to get started. At the end of the tutorial, I've provided a variation which will allow you to make an odd count ring. So you'll be able to make any size, but as I said, we're going to start with this one here. We're going to make an 8 count ring. So let's have a look at materials. Here I have all the materials we'll need to get started to make your first ring. There's a few basic things that you'll need. None of them are expensive, but you will need them. Let's start with this mat. This is a very inexpensive beading mat, and I've tried using other things. I tried a bit of felt, I've used a tea towel on a tray, which do work fine, but this is great because it stops the beads rolling away and you can fold it up. If you want to take your project on a journey, you can fold it up and pop it away. And as I said, they're very inexpensive, but this is great because it stops the beads rolling away. It's easy to pick the beads up, and if you're going to do a lot of beading, it's really helpful to have one. You can buy much fancier beading mats which are rigid and have an edge on them, so if you're going to do a lot more beading, then you might want to invest in one of those. But if you're just getting started, this is absolutely ideal. Second thing we're going to look at is twine. This is very similar to fishing twine. It's a nylon thread that has been designed specifically for beading. This one is called Fireline and is £6. You can get them in different weights, but I like £6 because it's really strong, but it's not too thick. You'll see I've got 125 yards. I do a lot of beading, so I buy a lot, but you can buy it in 50-yard reels, so you don't need to invest in quite so much. This one's crystal. You can buy it in black, I think, and possibly other colours, but this is the only one I've used. So we'll be using a bit of this. It's great. It's really strong, but it's nice and flexible as well. We also have beading needles. Now, it's really important that you buy specific beading needles for this project because the beads we're going to be using are really tiny. And if we have a little look here, ooh, one's popped out, that's handy. You'll see that it's very fine, and even when you get towards the eye, it remains very thin, which enables it to slip really easily through your beads. This is a size 12 by a company called John James, but you can buy other brands, but this is a good size for the beads that we're going to be using, so I would definitely recommend. This is a pack of 25. You don't need 25, but it's useful to have a few because they are quite delicate. They do sometimes break and they do bend, so it's good to have a few on hand. Next up, scissors, something a little bit sharp because it's cutting the nylon twine. Pencil. We'll be using this to mark off our pattern as we go. Now we come to the beads. Right, here we go. So the beads we're going to be using are a brand called Miyuki Delica, and they're size 11. And the reason that we're using these beads is because of their shape. So if I open a pop here, pour some onto my hand, I can show you what I mean. So traditional seed beads are rounded, but if you look very closely at these, you'll see that they're actually cylindrical, which means that they stack really nicely when we're making our rings. So if I bring back, I'm going to pop these on here. If I bring back our ring, you'll see that they sit really nicely.
Now you can do this technique with normal seed beads and it will look slightly different, but for this project I would recommend the Delica. They're made in Japan, they're beautifully made, they've got a huge range of colours and I really like working with them. And then lastly we have our pattern. So I've designed 3 patterns here, 6 rows, 7 rows and 8 rows, and the pattern we're going to be focusing on is the 8 rows. I've also provided in your resource pack some blank charts, so if after this you want to design your own, you can, or you can just make them up as you go along, which the more you do, you might find you want to be creative with it, so that's always an option. Right, let's move on to getting started. Before we get started on the actual ring, I want to just show you how to get started using these much bigger beads, because the beginning of the ring is the most difficult bit, and trying to show you with the tiny beads is a bit fiddly. So I've bought these hammer beads, and although they're a slightly different shape, they're a bit longer, the principle is the same, and hopefully it will be a bit clearer if I show you with these first. So let's say we're going to be making this 8-row ring here. You'll see that it's also divided up into columns. So we've got 4 beads in each column, and we'll be working up and down, which will become clearer as we go along. So to get started, we're going to need 8 beads on our twine. I've popped a stopper bead on here. I'll show you how to do this properly when we use the smaller beads. So I'm going to start by picking up 8 of these. That's 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, so I've got 8 on my twine. Now, the next row will be creating our 3rd row in our pattern. So I pick up 1, I'm going to miss that first bead at the end, and I'm going to go through that 2nd bead. Got some extra fluff on there, get rid of that. And I'm going to pull my needle through. And you'll see that that bead we've just threaded on should sit next to your bottom bead, nice and neatly. I'm going to pick up my next bead, and I'm going to miss out this bead here, and I'm going to go into the bead above it. Sometimes they get a bit twisted, so you can just give it a little pull like that. And again, you'll see that it's sitting next to its neighbour. So I pick up my next bead. I'll skip that one and I'll go in the one above. And then my last one, skip the bead above and go in the one at the top like that. Hopefully that should sit nice and snugly like that. So those beads are our first 3 rows. 1, 2, 3, or columns I should say, otherwise it gets confusing with these rows. So we're now up here and I'm going to work this row, so these 4 beads here. So I pick up my bead, ignore my little tail, and I'm going to ignore that top bead and I'm going to go through the first one that sticks out like that. Pick up my next bead, ignore the gap and go through the first one sticking out. I'm going to work my way down. And that's my last one. So there you can see I've completed the first 4 columns, and if I were to carry on with these beads I'd now change colour. So now I'm going to show you with the tiny beads. Right, now thread. I've cut myself a piece of thread. For you, if you want to make the ring without having to change thread halfway through, you'll need to cut a piece about 1.6 meters long. But for the sake of this tutorial, I've cut something a little bit shorter, just to make life easier while I'm filming. And also it means I can show you how to change thread halfway through. So if you do cut it a bit short, you'll know how to do that. So first things first, we need to thread our needle. This twine is a little bit thick, so I find if I give it a really good squish with my nails, and then push the needle onto the twine rather than the twine into the needle, it is fairly easy to thread. So I've done that. Next step is to pop on a stopper bead. You can use a much bigger bead for this if you want something that's really easy to see. I tend to just use one of the beads I'm going to be using, but a different colour to the one I'm going to be starting with. So I'm going to be starting with blue, so I'm going to use a pink stopper bead. So I run this bead almost to the end of my twine. I leave about 4 inches or 10 centimetres at the end. I'm going to be weaving this end in at the end, so I need something that I can thread, so it needs to be at least 10 centimetres. And I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to go back through the bead like this, and then pinching the bead in my forefinger and thumb, creating a loop, and just pull that tight. And that bead there is going to stop all my other beads from falling off. The way that I've done it means that you can shift it up and down if you need to, and at the end it's really easy to get off. You're not fiddling around untying tiny knots or anything, so that's really good. Okay, so as with the hammer beads, I'm going to start by putting 8 beads on my thread. I'm going to be starting with blue because, as we can see in the pattern, that's what it starts with. If you want to use different colours, of course that's absolutely fine. But to make life easier, I'll stick with the ones that we're using in the pattern. So I'm going to pick up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And as you can see, this mat does help to prevent them from moving around, which does make it easier to pick them up. Okay, so I've got 8 beads. I'm going to run them all the way down to my stopper bead. Okay, now the way I find it easiest to hold them is to pinch them between my forefinger and thumb. You might find another way that's more comfortable for you, but this just helps to stop them twisting and it helps to stop them wiggling around. I'm going to pick up my next blue bead, and as before I'm going to miss that first one and I'm just going to go through that second one. And it should sit right next to that first one like that. Okay. Now at this point you can see they've all wriggled up a bit, so I'm going to just push my stopper bead down, and that just helps to keep them from moving around too much. So I'm going to pick up my next bead, miss that next one, I'm going to go through the one above it, and then pinching it between my forefinger and thumb, I'm just going to pull that tight. And these do sit very nicely next to each other. Okay, so you should be at that point there. I'll pick up my next one. Ooh. And miss the one above and go through the one above that one there. Okay. And then last one for that column. miss the one above, and go through that last one there, like that. Okay, so you should look a little bit like that. As you can see, they start to look like bricks stacked up next to each other. And if we just quickly look at our pattern, and you'll see now why I've got this pencil, to make it easier for you to keep track of where you are in the pattern, because when you first start it can get a bit confusing with which column you're on, and when you're switching colour that can become confusing. So I like to make a little dot in each bead that I've done, and if you do this every time you complete a column, it will mean that you'll know where you're up to. So you can see here we now need to do 4 blues in our next column. So we pick up our work, and holding it, I always keep that stopper bead at the top, and then I always know which way up I am when I'm referring back to my pattern, so that's quite helpful to think of. Okay, so next little blue bead. So we miss that first one, go through the first one that's sticking out, and you'll see they sit nice and neatly next to each other. Next blue, through that one sticking out, and keep going all the way down. The more you do and the sturdier your piece of work becomes, the much easier it is to work with. As I said, the beginning is definitely the trickiest part. Once you've done that, you'll find that you get into a nice rhythm with it and it all becomes much more straightforward. Okay, so I've got my first 4 columns. I'm going to mark off that column there, and then I'm going to move on to the coral. So you'll see I've got to do, working this way up because our thread is down here, 1, 2, 3, 4 in the coral. Okay, and if I refer back to my pattern, I can see the next column is also 4 coral, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. Okay, so you can see it's starting to take shape, and it's tiny, but you can see it's starting to correspond to our pattern down here. I'm just going to work the next few columns so you can just see more of me switching colours, and then I'll come back to you when I need to change the thread so you can see how to do that. As you can see, my ring is progressing nicely, but the inevitable has happened and I've reached the end of my thread. Now I don't want to leave too short a piece of thread because I need to be able to weave that in at the end. So making sure I've got a little bit left over when I take my needle off and start my new piece. Now to save you watching me fiddle around threading a new needle, I've got one ready to go. So I'm going to start by going up through those two beads there. It can be a little bit fiddly going through at an angle. I'll pull that all the way through until I've just got a little tail left, something that I can weave in again, and then pinching those ends between my fingers and thumb to keep them out the way. I'm now just going to keep going with my next column. And when I get to the end of the ring, I will show you how to weave those ends in. Okay, I'm getting towards the end of my pattern and it's time to start thinking about what size I need to make my ring so that it's going to fit properly. And the easiest way to do it is to just try it on. So I'm going to, say I'm making it for this finger, I'm going to pop it over my finger like that, turn it over and just hold the edges almost together and see where we're up to. Now I found that you want them to be slightly on the tight side because over time they do loosen a little bit, and also if your fingers get cold they have a tendency to just fly off. So I would err on the side of tighter rather than looser. So I'm going to add 2 more columns onto mine and then I think I'm at the right size. I've made quite a lot of these rings now and I know that to fit that finger I need it to count 36 beads across the top. Once you've made a few, you'll figure out your size and you won't need to fit them anymore. You'll just know that if you make it 36 beads across, it's going to fit that particular finger. So that's quite a useful way of thinking about measurements. So I'm going to go ahead and add in my last column and then I'll show you how to finish off. I meant to say in the previous section that the way I've designed these charts, you can add in extra columns if you need to make the ring bigger, or you can take columns off. So you'll see this pattern goes up to this blue one here. To fit me, I only need to go as far as these 2 white columns here, so I haven't put those 2 in. But if you've got bigger fingers than me, you might need to add more, and if you've got smaller fingers than me, then you might need to take some off. So I've tried to design these patterns in such a way that you can add and subtract columns and it won't affect the pattern of the ring too much. Okay, we're nearing the end. So I've done my extra little columns there, you can see on the end, and I'm now going to remove my stopper bead because we no longer need that. So I'm just going to pull that off like that. And now I need to join my ends. So you'll see, in order for your ends to fit snugly together, you need to finish on an opposite column to the one you started on. So columns always worked in pairs, always, so that you end up with this sort of zipper effect at the 2 ends. And the way we're going to finish is really, really simple. Trying to ignore all those other loose ends I've got waving around. I'll weave those in a minute. So I'm just going to go through. So this is the first bead on the opposite side. Come through like that. And then through the first one that sticks out on the other side. So we're sort of going through the teeth, if that makes sense. Okay, and then I go through one on this side. Now you can pull it tight as you go if that's easier for you, but I just want to show you the sort of mechanics of it. So I'll go through that side. And then that last one at the top there. And you can see it's sort of almost laced, a little bit like a corset. And then we just pull that end and it will draw the two ends together like that in a very neat way. And then the last thing you need to do is weave in your ends. So I'm going to start by going over to the opposite side and go through 2 or 3 beads. The beauty of this twine is it's almost slightly wiry, so when you weave it through, it really holds its shape and it doesn't come undone, which is great. So I'm going to go through 2 or 3 beads like that. And then I'm just going to wind round a couple of those beads and then through a few diagonally, and then I'm going to trim that end. Now I'm just going to weave in these last few ends that we've got. You can see here why we need a little bit left over, just so we've got something to weave in. So similar to the last end, just going to go through a couple of beads like that. It doesn't matter which direction you go in, which 2 beads you weave around. You're going to go through here. Around here. Back up through those 3 beads. And I'm going to trim that end. Just going to finish by weaving those last 2 ends in and then we're done. All done! Well done. If you managed to stick along this far and you've managed to get your first beaded ring finished, you should be very, very pleased with yourself. If you would like to learn the variation that enables you to do an odd count ring, then stick around and I'll show you that next. But thank you for watching. Okay, so if you're watching this, it's because you would like to know how to create a ring that has an odd number of rows. So I've provided a pattern here for a ring that has 7 rows, but of course the same applies if you want to do 5, 9, 11, anything with an odd number of rows. There is a slight variation in the way that we work that allows us to do it. So I'm going to show you that now. It's a little bit more fiddly than the even count method, but once you've done it a couple of times, it will sort of become natural. So because we've got 7 rows, I'm going to start with 7 beads and I'll work using this pattern here. So I'm going to start with 7 coral beads. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I've already put my stopper bead on because we already know how to do that. And then the start of it is the same. So we pick up a bead, miss that first one, and go through the one above it. So to begin with, it will feel like we're doing the same thing. So miss the one above, go through the one above that, and then the same here. So we miss that one, go through the one above it. But Now you'll see that because we've only got one bead above that, we haven't got one to go into above it, so we have to do something a little bit different here. I'm just going to slightly move that stopper bead to keep it out of our way. So to do the variation, you pick up another bead and you go in through the top of that bead and then in through that one as well. It's going to feel fiddly, but I promise you can get the hang of it. So we go through those two beads like that. And then that bead should sit next to that top bead. We now need to do another move because we need ultimately for our thread to end up coming out of the top of here. So I'm going to go down through that bead, across, and then up through those three. So breaking that down, I go down through that bead, just that one. And I'm now going to go up through 1, 2, 3 at the same time, ideally. 1, 2, 3, and it's going to pop out the top there. Okay. Then I will go down through that bead, and we're now ready to do our next two columns. So the next two columns are worked in exactly the same way as you would on the even count. So my next column, I can see from my pattern, is all coral, and we've only got 3 beads in this column. And then going back up on my pattern, I can see they're the cream. I'm going to do 1, 2, and 3. And then we find ourselves in the same situation as we were a minute ago, where we haven't got anything to go into at the top. So this is where we do our move, our fancy move. So I pick up my next bead, I go in through those 2 beads like that, and give my bead a little nudge to sit in the right place. Doesn't always want to, but there we go. I've got them in the right place. And then I go down through that, just the 1 bead, like that, and then back up through those 3 diagonally. 1, 2, and 3. And then back down through that bead, and we're ready to start our next 2 columns. So I'll do it one more time just so you can get the hang of it. So next column is cream. Actually the next one as well, so that's easy. And we go back up. As normal. And then at the top, pick up my next bead, in, down through those 2, pop that one in place, through that one, and then back up through there, down through there, and we're ready to go. So that's the only difference, is you have to do that little extra move at the top of every other column, and the rest of it's the same. So you finish your ring, you finish on an opposite column, so you can see here they're the same, so I'd have to do 1 more column in order for those 2 ends to fit together. You finish off in exactly the same way, but doing an odd number of rows allows you to do things like diamonds, circles, crosses, which need to have an uneven number of rows. So it's a really nice variation to be able to do. I really like it. So yes, hopefully that's helped you out and you can get cracking.